Advertising Council Australia would like to begin by acknowledging and paying our respects to the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, who are the traditional custodians of the land from which we broadcast today. ACA would also like to acknowledge their culture of storytelling through art, dance and music, and we pay respect to the elders past, present and future on other lands throughout all communities who might be participating today.
Welcome to the results of the 2023 Create Space Census. This census study is brought to you by the Advertising Council of Australia, which today publishes the findings from the second Create Space Census. Now, the purpose of this census is to track our industry's progress on diversity and inclusion across Australia's advertising industry. And the results, as you're going to see today, speak to an average across the industry, which means that some extraordinary progress has been made in some agencies, less progress in others. But as you watch these results today, you might feel that your agency has made huge strides forward. For others watching today, your agency may have only started on the work that needs to be done. My name is Rose Herzeg, and I am the chair of the DE&I committee of the ACA, and I am delighted to welcome our ACA National Head of Engagement, Hannah Sturrock, who's going to take us through the results, which I think you'll agree are interesting for us all. Over to you, Hannah.
Thank you, Rose. Hello, everybody. So good to be back 2 years after the first time we did this. If this is your first time, welcome. If you're a frequent flyer, round 2, that is awesome as well. We are going to have a good session today. We've got some excellent panelists joining us for the second half. And I wanted to start by saying thank you to everybody who took part in the census again last year. This biennial survey gives us a genuine insight into progress and barriers across the whole industry. So a big thank you to everyone who filled it out and who promoted it. 81% of respondents said that they were actively encouraged by senior leadership to complete the census. So that's a good result. In a moment, Renata Yanoulis from TBWA is going to join me, and we're going to present a sort of snapshot of the results. We don't want to overwhelm you with all the stats. Honestly, I'd love to share it with you in great detail. I freaking love this stuff, but it will overwhelm you and you'll just glaze over. So we're going to keep the results part of the webinar fairly top line to allow time for discussion and questions. Now, throughout the webinar, please use the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen if you do have questions that you'd like us to answer. We have the team from Kantar with us today on the webinar, and they're going to be keeping an eye on the Q&A and answering some questions directly as we go. All the detail is in the report. So this is the new report. You can download it from our website after the webinar. Driving action on DE&I can feel like climbing an ever-growing mountain, but we have a 6-step action plan available to everyone in the industry with practical advice for tackling exclusion and discrimination, along with loads of useful resources and training ideas. I urge everybody to explore that all on our hub after the session finishes. And a quick note here, we know that for many people, it can be tough to hear your experiences reduced to statistics and graphs. And we encourage people to seek support if any of the topics we discussed today or in the report cause distress in any way. So before Renata joins me, I want to just provide some context for everyone watching. The census can only provide us with averages across the whole industry, which integrates the great, the good, and the less than ideal. We're drawing themes from these big, varied data sets. And as Rose said, every business is different, and many tuning in today will be ahead of the average, having spent a lot of time and money on improving DE&I in the last 2 years. At ACA, we speak to agencies on a daily basis, and we see so much investment into creating inclusive workplaces and improving policies. And we featured some of these in our case studies that we published last year. Compared to where we were 4 years ago, the industry overall is more aware and more sensitive, but we must stay vigilant. And one of the most challenging things about DE&I is the more aware we become of what's possible, the higher our expectations and the harder it is to move the needle on how we feel about progress. And for people like me with 20 years in the industry, we naturally have a different perspective on how far we've come compared to those who are newer, but perception is reality, and we all carry our own biases into this session. We encourage everyone listening today to step back if you can, stay curious, acknowledge progress, and rather than using the data as a stick to beat ourselves up, I invite everyone to use it as a beacon of insight to keep us on track, doing what we can as individuals as well as companies to improve diversity, equity, and inclusion at work. So I'd like to invite Renata Yanulis from TBWA to join me now on screen. Hi, Renata.
Hi, Hannah. And hello, and thank you to everyone joining us today. It's great to be back and share where we're at in 2024. The census covered a lot, and this is just an overview of the topics within the report. So today we'll be concentrating on what's changed, the good and the bad, and some of the drivers behind those changes. We have structured the results in the report by different segments and groups of people to make it easy to understand and address, but of course, people don't exist in verticals. So it's essential to take an intersectional approach to DE&I strategy and implementation.
Yeah, so here's just a quick snapshot of the response base. We were happy to get almost 2,500 anonymous responses to the census at the end of last year from across the country. The responses were mostly from people working in advertising and full service agencies, but we also had input from the wider industry. The core demographic profile is very similar to the 2021 census across gender, age, location, department, which confirms that we are looking at a pretty good comparative picture between the two censuses. Is that a word? As we were 2 years ago, compared with the Australian workforce, the advertising industry is unsurprisingly younger. 81% of respondents are aged under 45 and 51% are aged under 34. And we're more female and more concentrated in Sydney and Melbourne. And there's no change to this statistic. We are still a majority female industry. Those who identify as female account for 62% of respondents, with 36% male identifying and 1% non-binary or gender non-conforming. It's pretty similar to 2021. This broadly aligns with ACA's salary survey data. So again, the census response is representative of the industry today. One stat that has changed since 2021, in our sample, female representation at executive management and C-suite level has increased by 8 percentage points in the last 2 years, now sitting at 54%. And this is a really positive shift as we aim for gender representation to be in line with the overall makeup of the industry at all levels, not just junior and mid-level roles. More females in leadership roles is also critical to close the gender pay gap that exists.
For transparency, 2 levels are grouped together in our reporting to allow us to benchmark accurately. When we split the levels, the C-suite is still marginally male-dominated at 56%. This is still a strong result, though, as global benchmarks for senior leadership teams use a 40-40-20 rule. That is, at least 40% female representation, 40% male, and 20% either gender. On this basis, we have achieved what many industries are still aiming for at a C-suite level. The numbers are not so even in the creative department, however. with females holding only 30% of C-suite or executive management roles, despite almost half of the respondents working in creative and design identifying as female. Positively, this figure has improved considerably since 2021. So if we continue to mentor talented female and gender non-conforming individuals, the gender balance in creative leadership could be much improved by the time we next run the census in 2 years.
Looking at ethnicity, most of us, 64%, identify primarily as Australian, but the census allowed people to select more than one ethnicity. We've grouped them here for clarity, but captured a detailed list. Our workforce overall has a fairly diverse makeup, but with a distribution broadly similar to the Aussie population. The ethnic majority come from Anglo-Celtic origins with a long tail across many other ethnicities, which make up our ethnic minority population. In 2023, 1.5% of the industry identify as Aboriginal, Torres Strait, or other Indigenous Oceanians, compared with 3.2% of the population. This has increased from 1.2% in 2021.
Despite overall ethnic diversity, we do see senior roles strongly dominated by the ethnic majority. So this pattern hasn't shifted since 2021. Back to the question of whether Adland has made progress on DE&I in the last 2 years, 70% believe their company is actively taking steps to be more diverse and inclusive. One of these steps that many companies have taken is to review their DE&I policies and procedures and make their staff aware of them. It's a useful stat to track as it's entry level for organizations of any size and a lead indicator of change. There should be no barriers for companies in improving awareness at the very least of their policies. It was good to see this metric increase from 53% to 59% in those 2 years.
We'd like to see this percentage even higher though. So here's a request for all leaders watching this. Communicate your strategy simply and your progress regularly. 5 questions can guide your strategy. Where are we? Why are we there? Where could we be? How could we get there? Are we getting there? Then update and communicate your policies and make them accessible to everyone. You would be amazed at how many people say they don't know where to find these basic aspects of their employment, or they're under the impression that your policies haven't been updated in years when in fact they have, but they're buried somewhere deep on the intranet.
A reminder that the Create Space Hub contains free templates for gender-neutral parental leave, menopause, flexible public holidays, and gender affirmation policies, as well as the Create Safe Space Toolkit, guiding action on sexual harassment. In addition to more awareness of strategy and policies and the increase in female senior leadership, there were a number of other areas of improvement worth calling out. A 2 percentage point reduction in sexual harassment of females at work in the last 12 months to 6%, and a 7-point increase in the voluntary reporting of sexual harassment, indicating an improvement in fostering a speak-up culture. In the same vein, we also saw a 6-point increase in voluntary sharing of health conditions with employers.
The gains might seem small, but this is normal for long-term change initiatives like Create Space. A couple of other improvements: a 5 percentage point increase in LGBTQ+ people who are out at work to 61%, a small increase in LGBTQ+ people in senior leadership roles from 9 to 10%, a 4-point decrease in observed casual discrimination, and a small decrease in the overall likelihood to leave the industry due to exclusion or discrimination to 19%. Although this figure varies depending on the audience. We'll come back to this.
The census asked about current working arrangements, and we found that the average number of mandated days in the office is broadly in line with the number of days people would like to spend in the office, 2.3 versus 2.1. Some flexibility is still the norm, with only 2% reporting a 5-day in-office mandate. Only 7% of respondents say they work part-time, which is much lower than the 21% figure reported by the Workplace Gender Equality Agency. We know the topic of flexibility and hybrid working continues to be debated, especially in connection with feelings of belonging, and we'll discuss this topic with our panel. One of the most interesting data points was that overall 35% of people had noticed significant positive changes that had impacted DE&I at work in the last 1 to 2 years. We asked people to share what these big changes were. Some examples: a gender equitable leadership team, a bigger focus on education and upskilling, specific leave related to menopause and gender affirmation, and introduction of flexible holiday where staff can swap public holidays for days they recognise. And there were many more. But overall, 1 in 3 people say things are different in a good way compared to 2 years ago. The interesting part was that this 35% stat shifted dramatically depending on who was answering the question. The percentage noticing significant positive changes jumps to 64% amongst C-suite respondents, a group that may have done much of the work on strategy and policy, but don't typically suffer from exclusion or discrimination at work.
Yeah, this graph really tells the story of where we're at with DE&I. 35% of people reporting improvements at work in the last 2 years is solid feedback. If we'd asked this question 3 years ago, the numbers would have been so much lower, but we can see there's an opportunity to better connect with and support people outside of the leadership team, as well as females, gender non-conforming people, and LGBTQ+ respondents. This is a theme of the census this year. There's clearly a gap when it comes to noticing significant progress on DE&I, a gap that most strongly correlates with seniority and age. And this is not an indictment of leadership. We would expect at least 65% of C-suite to have noticed change in the last 2 years. It would be worrying if they hadn't. The stat helps us see, though, that it's not one size fits all. And while the work that has been done is essential, and we hope it continues, there's more to do because it takes time for actions at the top to register with everyone as significant improvements to their experience at work. It's important to address this gap rather than dismiss it, because a lot of the verbatim answers we received suggest that cynicism is creeping into the conversation, and that's one of the biggest barriers in a way to driving progress. So we hope this insight might help us guide the next phase of work, and we will discuss this theme with our panel at the end. So there have been improvements and there is a gap in perceptions of progress. We'll move on to our key metric, the inclusion index. Kantar benchmarks performance using an inclusion score calculated by asking questions about people's sense of belonging at work, the absence of discrimination, and the presence of negative behaviors. So there are kind of 3 streams of questions that contribute to the index, and they form an overall inclusion index score out of 100. Kantar has used the inclusion index in many markets, so it's a powerful benchmarking tool nationally and globally. So our overall industry inclusion index score this round is 56, which is 6 points lower than it was in 2021, and in line with the Australian norm of 55. This was last measured by Kantar in 2022 using exactly the same methodology. Kantar's research also charts a global trend of declining inclusion index scores, with 8 out of 12 markets decreasing between 2019 and 2022.
Our inclusion index score was influenced by a 5-point decline in a sense of belonging and a 3-point increase in the presence of negative behaviour, while absence of discrimination has remained static. Kantar found that the average industry inclusion index score was 55, the global marketing, advertising, PR and market research industry score was 54, and the media industry was 51.
So yeah, we've definitely drifted towards average on this measure, which might provide some reassurance that we're not underpacing the rest of the world, but average is not something we should ever be satisfied with. So there's a 6-point decline in overall inclusion at work, but who's feeling the drop most acutely?
We can benchmark inclusion for different cohorts. This slide shows the overall inclusion index score changes by gender identity. As per 2021, males continue to have a stronger inclusion score than females, although their score also drops 4 percentage points. Females reported a more prominent decline of 7 points, widening that gap.
And just a note here, the gender nonconforming inclusion index score remains very low. And while it appears to have increased from 2021, the base is too low to be statistically significant. So we should consider this data point indicative. Looking through a different lens, this time age, and inclusion dropped for all groups. The strongest inclusion scores are either end of the age spectrum, those newer to the industry, 16 to 24-year-olds, and those who have stuck it around to the positively ancient 45 plus age group. However, it's the groups in the middle, aged 25 to 44, who experience the lowest levels of inclusion. And this is a key point at which we need to retain talent. While the youngest age group has one of the highest inclusion scores of 60, they saw the biggest drop versus 2021, a trend that we want to focus on reversing to prevent a retention issue starting to occur at a younger age.
We also saw big drops in inclusion index scores for LGBTQ+ people, Asian respondents, and people with a physical disability. They all register low feelings of belonging and higher levels of discrimination and negative behaviour. 11% identify being of Asian ethnicity in our industry, one of the largest representations of ethnic minorities in our sample. If you are part of this group, you are 4 times more likely to experience discrimination or microaggressions based on your ethnicity compared to the overall sample. Half of our Asian respondents have observed casual discrimination, and 24% have had their name consistently mispronounced or have been given a nickname without asking, double the overall rate. Discrimination is one driver of exclusion. The index gives us insights into what else is undermining inclusion and belonging, and what were the factors that pulled our inclusion score down in the last 2 years. The sense of belonging index is fed by multiple questions, and we saw a decline on all elements. The biggest declines were believing managers are fair when it comes to hiring or career advancement, feeling sufficiently supported to develop skills and progress careers, and feeling emotionally and socially supported at work.
In terms of the presence of negative behaviour index, being interrupted or ignored in meetings remains the most common negative behaviour or microaggression, with almost half of respondents having experienced this. But the biggest changes versus 2021 that really knocked our score down were on learning opportunities or progress being restricted by managers, feeling undervalued in comparison to colleagues of equal competence, and feeling excluded from events or activities. So there's a theme coming through in these latest results. Inclusion and belonging are strongly affected by professional recognition and supportive managers, access to learning opportunities, and whether career progression is fair and free from bias. Another theme which relates to the gap we mentioned earlier is a need to shift focus to the middle layer of the industry, specifically engaging them as key agents in improving feelings of belonging and reducing negative behaviour. We need to better educate and support mid-career employees for them to be able to pay it forward to their teams and colleagues, creating a kind of flywheel effect on day-to-day team inclusion. This means more manager-level training to ensure career development and skills are being prioritised and they understand their role in making work more inclusive and diverse for others. And this is another area we'll discuss with the panel at the end.
Given we're a majority female industry and the low inclusion index score for female identifying respondents, we wanted to look at some of the drivers behind that. Experiences of negative behaviour at work are part of the story. Negative behaviours range from everyday microaggressions to the extremes of bullying and harassment. This chart here shows the changes in scores for females between 2021 and 2023. Being interrupted or ignored may seem minor, but it's the frequency of this type of microaggression that can have a disproportionate impact. 37% feel undervalued compared to colleagues of equal competence. 28% feel learning opportunities or progress have been restricted by managers. This factor increased 6 percentage points since 2021. And 26% have been bullied, undermined, or harassed. And 6% have experienced sexual harassment at work in the last year. 6% is still too high, but it is good to see this statistic dropping slightly.
Another key stat behind female exclusion was that for many respondents, taking parental leave stalls career progression. This impacts leadership diversity, particularly in the creative department, but also in many others. Bias in progression and promotion opportunities is also a key driver of the gender pay gap. Females are 10 times more likely than males to feel unsupported by their company when returning to work after parental leave. The biggest reason for feeling unsupported, it was assumed I was less committed to my job, 62%. This is an example of unconscious bias, which might initially be due to poor manager decisions, but it's then perpetuated by the absence of company processes and guardrails. The antidote could be surprisingly simple and requires relatively little investment. Continue to advocate for her because she still works here.
So what is the impact of this on our retention figures? The overall likelihood of leaving the industry due to a lack of inclusion or discrimination has only slightly improved since 2021, dropping from 20% to 19%. The 1 in 5 number changes as we divide responses into segments. For female identifying respondents, the likelihood increases to 23% versus 13% for males. For females who have taken parental leave in the past 5 years, it's 28%. For females who are also ethnic minorities, it goes up further to 31%.
For LGBTQ plus people, it's higher than average at 27%. And for gender non-conforming people, it's 36%. For people suffering with ongoing stress conditions, it's 27%. And when asked what they'd prioritize in their next company, we again come back to the key themes of the census. More diverse leadership, flexible working, a fairer approach to pay and promotion, and a commitment to close the gender pay gap. The lower inclusion scores might be frustrating for many people today, given the clear efforts of senior leaders and many industry groups to drive progress on DE&I. And as I said at the start, achieving progress in just 2 years is not easy, despite what it might look like from the outside. And we have made progress in patches, but this is more of a long-term brand value category, not short-term effects. So there's a different scale here that we need to kind of get comfortable with. There's no room for DE&I fatigue. So don't dismiss the stat that 1 in 3 people have noticed significant positive changes to DE&I in the last 2 years. To really create space for everyone, we must take an action and then another one and then another one, and every single one of us can make an impact. Lots of small daily actions that people can see and feel are key. The Create Space Hub is full of ideas and resources to help you, and many of them will not cost you anything. Have you got a flexible public holiday policy? Have you normalized pronouns and pronunciation tools in signatures and meetings? In terms of formal training, have you put your team through the SBS inclusion program for $75 per person? Have you enrolled your mid-career team members in AdSchool's Manager Fundamentals course? There's one starting next week to help them feel empowered to drive progress on the company's behalf.
And we still point to the Create Space action plan to guide businesses on their journey. The 6 actions are still powerful in their simplicity. If implemented thoughtfully and reinforced consistently, they will improve inclusion scores over time.
Here's a quick reminder of the 6 areas for action. Each one has 3 specific steps against it. Phase 1 covered gender, mental health, and microaggressions. And phase 2, developed by industry working groups with lived experience, focused on support for LGBTQ plus people, ethnic minorities, and people with disability. You can download the full report and access all the tools and resources at createspace.org.au. And let's now bring the rest of the panel back on screen for a discussion on the key themes that we're seeing in this round of the census. Hi. So
Hi.
today, joining us, we've got Rose, who you've met, and some of our DE&I committee members. So we have Simon Wassef, who also presented with me 2 years ago, Chief Strategy and Experience Officer at Clemenger BBDO, and Jess Farrell, General Manager, People and Culture, and Head of DE&I and Publicist Group. There was a lot of data and a lot more in the report. But firstly, I'd love to hear your initial reactions to the findings. I'll start with Rose.
Well, can I just say, Renata and Hannah, great job. Thank you. That's a lot of information to get through. You've done an awesome job of really giving us the facts of what we're seeing. My first response is what you said there, Hannah, when you said 1 in 3 of us has noticed a positive change. That's a fantastic place to start. There is progress. There needs to be more. You said it best when you said that we've got progress in patches. We've got more senior women in leadership positions. The one thing that I love the most is the insight around the research that suggests that inclusion also means getting access to teaching opportunities and getting access to any kind of training that can get you to improve upon your career track. And I want us all to remember that immediately being included means being seen and being given opportunities to progress in the career. So we've made progress. I'm thrilled about that. There is a lot more to do. This isn't going to get solved in 6 months or 1 year. This is a journey, but we are better than where we were 2 years ago on some metrics. We've got more work to do, but I'm probably most excited by the fact that the action plan, that 6-point action plan, gives us practical things that we can do.
Yeah. And just a reminder to everyone, put any questions for the panel in the Q&A. Simon, what about you? What were your thoughts? We were here 2 years ago, and it was all new then.
Yeah. Welcome back to the conversation. I think is how I sum it up. It's like a TV series where there was twists and turns last time, and now there's even more twists and turns. And I think that's okay. This is a complex conversation. And I want to just talk about those 2 C's for a second. Hannah, the complexity is there to be embraced. As we're professionals, we like to tick things off. We like to get things done on time, on budget. This conversation doesn't quite work that way, and that's okay. That's a good thing. And we are embracing the complexity, because just because some of the things we talked about 2 years ago, we're moving on, doesn't mean it's job done and we can all sort of, move on to the next thing. There are things that we have to embrace, new ideas, new concepts that are coming out of that. I think last time we talked about microaggressions, we talked about double jeopardy effects. These were all new. That was new news. And now you look at this now and you go, there's more new news. There's points about minding the gap. There's points about, the importance of education. The point here is that complexity then moves into that conversation, the second C. How can we move all those pieces forward? How can we continue, everything for everyone, everywhere? We see some interesting conversation around, there's still a majority female industry. It's increasingly female-led, amazing. But are we seeing that for members of our LGBTQ plus community, for our trans community, for our disabled community? Not quite. So there's more parts of the conversation to open up, more to do. I'm an optimist. We can do it. We can get there, but it's about continuing that conversation and embracing that complexity.
Yeah, and it's good to say that. It would be good if we could stay optimistic in the face of it all. How about you, Jess? What was your sort of response to the data? I mean, these guys have seen a lot of data from me over the last 6 months, by the way. This is not their first reveal.
Thanks, Hannah. Hey, everybody. Thanks so much for joining the call today. I think for me, one of the things that I'm reminded about when we attend these types of calls is that DE&I isn't owned by one particular person. The concept of DE&I is so broad, and each and every one of us has a responsibility in our own companies and in our broader industry to really represent and be part of that culture and that DE&I experience. And so hopefully, as we went through, as Hannah and Rana went through that today, you feel that you personally have been seen. If you were somebody that filled in that survey, thank you very much. That's really important data for us. And you feel personally seen and heard, and that there were some stats there that really resonated with you. And hopefully that you feel also empowered and inspired to think about what you might be able to do in your own agencies and in your own day-to-day working experiences to help us increase and improve that experience for you yourself, and then equally for all your teammates around you.
Yeah, so the first theme that we identified was mind the gap. We know that work is being done in many businesses, and senior leaders are very aware of the progress that we've made, but 1 in 3 people, is good, but the effort isn't yet converting to kind of overall feelings of inclusion for everyone. There's a little bit of cynicism kind of creeping in that it's all talk, no action. Is this comment fair? How do we continue to close this gap? Simon?
Yeah, I think this is a really interesting observation. I think the data showing us that, I think it was that chart that said the C-suite were feeling like the progress was up here, and then it sort of dropped off and everyone else is kind of around here. For me, this is where we have a risk of falling into a bit of a two-speed economy, that, while the C-suite are kind of saying, we're getting things done, we're putting things out there, the audience who it's intended for doesn't feel it, or can't see it, or doesn't know how to access it. That sort of feeling that we're sort of, I don't think it's, the cynicism maybe comes from a sense of, you're out there sort of saying we are doing these things, but then people on the ground can't feel it. When you walk the floor, they can't sort of, it's not tangible, they can't grasp it. I think you still see some of the comments in the survey, and I encourage everyone to read the verbatims, because that's where a lot of the texture comes from. It's one thing to talk about, parental leave, and then it's another to see people who've gone to have kids, feels like they weren't really that serious about it. So, they've sort of lost their spot in the, on the career path. And, people see those two things. They look sort of inside the organization and then they look around them. And I encourage everyone who's in this conversation, keep looking around you, because as soon as we start to feel as though there's two speeds to the D&I conversation, I think that's where we've got a real watch out. And I think, I want to talk to my fellow, old blokes who are on this call. We know how this is. We know that when we go to, B&T Women in Media Awards and Jane Caro says, look around you, are you the only bloke on the table? If we are still the only bloke on the table, that means we're at risk of a two-speed conversation that's happening here, that we're telling ourselves we're doing the work, but then we're walking the floors, we're in the industry, we're working with our colleagues, and they aren't seeing it, they aren't feeling it the same way that we think we're transmitting it. So that, for me, that observation is really key, is how can you make sure the things we're doing don't fall into a bit of a trap of, the exec meeting going, we're doing well on this, and our people who are doing the work aren't feeling the outcomes.
Yeah. Jess, Publicis Group's invested a lot of time and money in inclusion and diversity programs and really progressive policies. What else can businesses do on this front?
Well, I think really to consider, I suppose, to your reference, Simon, about that two-speed economy, is really looking at having a lot of the DE&I work led or at least considered and inputted by people across the agency. So at Publicis Group, we have a number of employee resource groups. So that's a connected group of people that might be about a particular topic or something that they're related to, that are able to connect and discuss some of those lived experiences that they might have, but equally provide input to the direction of the business. So what I mean there, for example, is recently we launched Enable, our publicist group, employee resource group that's focused on supporting people with visible and non-visible disabilities. So whilst I might lead the DE&I efforts more broadly across publicists, it's really important that the people part of Enable are providing input and perspective on some of the decisions that we might be making. Caveat, not to put the entire onus on the people in Enable. So there's a very clear difference between the onus and the responsibility of the business as such, and then the people with the lived experiences. Because quite often what can happen is businesses might say, great, you can solve all our challenges or focus areas in that space. That's really important that doesn't happen, and that there's time and investment and consideration made from a business perspective. But that should hopefully support you in closing that gap between what the people sitting perhaps at a C-suite table are thinking versus the general population of employees. And I also really liked your comments before, Hannah, about communication when you're thinking about those 5 key points of a strategy, and encouraging to and ensuring that on a regular basis, people are hearing, seeing, breathing, feeling all of those things that you're talking about in that space. That would hopefully help to close those gaps. Listening to your employees and allowing them to provide feedback and input, making sure that there's accountability from a business perspective, and communicating your strategy. They would be the 3 things from my perspective.
Yeah, I saw a post from Adam Grant the other day that sort of referred to new research on intellectual humility and how it reduces polarization. And it was the people who leave their echo chambers are the ones who know their knowledge is incomplete, which is sort of intellectual humility. A key to lifelong learning is engaging with others who disagree with you. And this made me reflect on how we must see the census data as interesting rather than argumentative in a way. The second theme is around the might of the middle and arming the army of influencers. Top-down action is important, but all the heavy lifting can't be done by the executive team. We need to engage and empower mid-career people in the inclusion program. They have enormous influence, but perhaps just too busy with their day jobs to helpfully use that influence. What steps should we take here? Rose or Simon, would you like, one of you like to take that one?
Maybe I'll start, Simon, and you jump in as well. But I think for us at WPP, what happens when you ask people to trial some of these policies is that they give you feedback in real time about what's working and what's not. What I love about the middle, which is the most important part of our industry, because this is the future, these are the future leaders, is giving us real-time feedback on which DE&I policies work and which of them just look and sound good on paper. And so for me, it's a little bit of try before you buy, or getting the people within the middle rungs to really experience the kinds of policies that we're putting into place. It's really interesting what happens when you see what it's like to, for example, exchange a public holiday or a cultural holiday that is relevant to you, or figuring out your parental leave based on the way you and your partner want to raise children. So for me, it's really getting people to sample the goods and give us immediate feedback in real time. And I know for us at Group M, VML, Hogarth, Ogilvy, AKQA, Burson, we've changed a lot of the things that we thought at the leadership level were good. And then when the people started to really use them, we went, oh, okay, we've got to tweak that one, or that isn't quite right, or that doesn't quite work in the real world. And I'm sure Simon can add plenty to this, but to me, a living policy is action. If it's just sitting in a shelf and it looks really nice, but nobody touches it, it's not going to be helpful. Over to you.
Look, Rose, I completely agree. I think the other bit of that is when that feedback comes, get comfortable with being uncomfortable. You know, it's surprise, you know, some of the things we design in those spaces, and it makes sense in behind the 4 walls, it doesn't to an audience, or they give you feedback that says, we didn't even see it that way. Get comfortable with that. You know, that's okay too. But yeah, back to the point about that sort of conversation. I think for me, the big learning here is some of that feedback will be tough to take. Good. take it, because this is the future of the industry. Do we want them to stay or not? And I'd rather design something and keep designing it around hard feedback that's good versus everyone sort of nodding and going, yeah, it's okay. And then, in 2 years, we don't see any progress.
And how do we best ensure that career progression is fair and unbiased? Jess, have you got some thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think when we're considering career progression, I suppose there's lots of different areas in my mind that could be included as part of that. So not necessarily just formal educational style training and promotions, but equally opportunities for mentoring, on-the-job learning, coaching, networking opportunities, etc. So when I'm thinking about all of those different areas, some of the things that we could be applying in our own workplaces to ensure that that's fair and equitable include things like a clear and transparent criteria for decision making when it comes to career progression and promotions. It might be a standardized evaluation process. So does your business have interview guides or a key set of interview questions that you might be considering as part of your promotional decision making process? Sometimes if you don't have that, what can happen is questions lead in different ways, and all of a sudden it's really hard to compare an apple to an orange because you haven't even asked those same questions to different candidates. It might be things like career development plans for employees. It might be, do we have a diverse panel of decision makers when we're making these decisions, or is everybody that's making this decision very similar in terms of their career experience and outlook on things? How do we ensure that we've got different people as part of that decision? How do we ensure that we're doing regular audits and monitoring? So at Publicis, we're always looking at, well, what has been the split on gender of promotions and decision-making on salary increases, for example? How quickly were those decisions made? Is there a particular department or area of the business where we're seeing one particular gender being promoted more often than others? Why is that? Let's investigate that further. The last part might be supporting work-life balance for employees to ensure that those that may actually be working perhaps flexi hours or different remote working, are they being considered for career progression opportunities? And how do we recognise diverse contributions of employees? So if it's not necessarily traditional contributions from a standard responsibility skill set, how else might we be looking at different ways for people to progress across the organisation?
Yeah, and that's a nice segue to the third theme, which is sort of how do we operationalize inclusive flexibility, hybrid working, part-time work, flexible hours. They're all being debated in the industry, and it's essential to sort of talk about flexibility as more than just number of days in the office. We know that it's quite a dynamic process, and belonging is a dynamic process. But we see that being in the office can help with those feelings of belonging, but at the same time, for sort of minority identified employees and people with caring responsibilities, remote work may actually offer more feelings of belonging in some cases. How should we approach this topic, Simon?
We're really quick on this one. I think I urge, the industry to look at this as an experience design problem. We're practitioners in that. We do it for our clients every day. So why do we not think about our working as an evolving experience that we design around our stakeholders, which is our people? And I think we were looking for a binary answer for so long. Are we there or not? And I think that's, we move the conversation on. Again, it's a conversation into how can we design something around our people, and as they change and as things change and as our needs change, we keep designing it. That sort of ability to look around and get other people to have an input, to bring that mighty middle into that conversation, to turn to the experts and go, how might you help design this? For me, that's it's something we do all the time for our clients. Let's treat ourselves the same way.
Jess, what about you?
Well, when I think about operationalizing inclusive flexibility, what we're talking about there is not just allowing people to work flexibly, but what are the rituals, traditions, processes that best support everybody in terms of them being the best version of themselves at work and being able to deliver what they need to. So things for me might be thinking about, how are we socializing and celebrating things at work? Is it that we go down the pub? And if we are going down the pub, does that work for everybody in the business now as things start to change? It might be, how do I have an open conversation with my direct reports, some of which that are in the office and some that aren't, about how they show up when things are going well, and how they might how they respond when things aren't going so well. How do I get the best out of them and ensure that everybody in our team knows that? It might be equipping managers with the skills about communication and building trust. It might be providing equitable access to tools and resources. So is everybody able to do the role that they need to in the environment that they best work in? It might be celebrating diverse working styles and shining a light on some of the things that are working really well currently in your organisation. And it might also then be reaching out to businesses like Parents at Work to find support. Mums in Ads that was recently launched. Let's talk to some experts about how we can best support and implement those practices. So really thinking about those rituals and traditions in your organisation, not what the policy is on page, to ensure that people feel absolutely included when they're thinking about their own flexibility and what can best support them.
Rose, did you want to add something?
I think Jess coined the phrase. Wouldn't it be lovely if we asked every one of our people, how do I get the best out of you? If you just let them start the conversation, and they would say, you get the best out of me by allowing me to work in this hybrid fashion, or allowing me to care for somebody who needs some help in my family, or allowing me to have thinking time. It would be wonderful if we began the conversation by getting our people to design a program where they are exceptional, productive, and happy. Maybe we just need to ask people what they hope to achieve, and once we've done that, we can figure it out together. But what's interesting is asking people. We've all got people, and every one of those people probably has a line manager, training all managers from the very top down to simply ask all of our people, how do I get the best out of you? How do you want to design your working time? And I think, honestly, to be included means to be heard and seen. I suspect that if we began the conversation like that, we'd get a very different answer. And so I suspect a much happier workforce. And maybe, Hannah, 2 years from now, when we run this census again, maybe, and I can see in our action plan, we've got the tools to get our people to ask questions like that. So that's the one thing that I would add. And I mean, Jess kind of said it best, how do I get the best out of someone?
Yes, it's a multi-layered question, and it allows for the non-binary answer, doesn't it? We've run out of time, which is a shame. Renata, I just realized you've been sort of looking at questions. I don't think there's anything there that is a burning one. Have you seen anything that we should address? I did see one that said something about we'd love to see more diverse representation in Ad Council. When can we see that? It's funny because I was thinking, like, we're a very small team at ACA. It's probably 15 of us. But within that group, we've got people who are definitely older than average. We've got people who are from ethnic minorities. We have people who are neurodivergent. We have people from the LGBTQ plus community. We have people from different socioeconomic backgrounds. So even within quite a small group, I do see quite a lot of diverse experiences reflected in just the Ad Council team. Renata, was there anything else that you wanted to throw?
There was one question around, I guess, in combat to the people that are really trying their best to live and breathe more DE&I into the agency. How do you deal with cancel culture in the industry if you do speak up?
Yeah, we did see still that kind of barriers to reporting was still pretty consistent to 2021. And I don't know if we've made it if we've really managed to tackle that. Rose, do you have any thoughts?
No, I think, look, and I think in the interest of time, Hannah, I think if there's maybe if we've got those questions, maybe we do shoot a follow-up on some of those questions, because I'm just seeing something coming through, but I'm also mindful that people have to jump off. Yeah.
I know. You know, I just love to answer questions with data. Okay, yes, thank you. No, we will wrap it up there because I know people have got other things to do. And it has been a really good discussion. I hope that everybody felt that they got quite a lot of insights, tips, perspectives on the data, the report, and on what we can all do based on this this information. And it is down to the individuals, not just the sort of CEO to drive change in this area. So hopefully everyone feels that kind of optimism and motivation to take this forward and keep driving progress for the industry, because we deserve it and we want it and people care about it. So let's just all go about creating more space. And with that, thank you, Renata. Thank you, Rose. Thank you, Simon. Thank you, Jess. And thank you to everybody who tuned in. Download the report, and the recording will be available on our website shortly. Thanks, everybody.